The smell hit me first, that particular mix of pine cleaner and cheap coffee that I'd spent 15 years trying to forget. My sister-in-law's kitchen, the place where, 3 days after my mother-in-law's funeral, I opened my banking app and watched the number on the screen not make sense for a full 10 seconds. $43,218. Gone. I remember the exact feeling. Not panic, something colder than that. Like stepping onto ice and feeling it flex under your foot before it decides whether or not to hold you. My husband was in the next room. I could hear him laughing at something his sister said, that easy laugh he only had around his family, the one that always made me feel like I was watching him through a window. I sat at that kitchen table with my phone in both hands and I did not say a word. I had learned by then to wait before I spoke. Let me back up. Because none of this starts at the kitchen table. It starts 4 months earlier, on a Tuesday in February when my mother-in-law had her first stroke. She was 68. Sharp as anything, the kind of woman who could hold 5 conversations simultaneously and remember every detail of each one. She'd built a small property management business in the Okanagan over 30 years. Nothing enormous but solid. 3 rental properties, a storage facility, a decent investment portfolio. She'd managed herself with a spreadsheet and a lot of stubbornness. When she got sick, she couldn't handle it anymore. My husband was the older child. His sister was the youngest by 6 years, Vanessa, who had never held a job for longer than 8 months in her life, who had been bailed out financially so many times by their mother that she'd stopped even pretending to feel embarrassed about it. Vanessa's husband, Brandon, had the particular confidence of someone who had never actually earned anything but had convinced himself otherwise. I'd built my own bookkeeping practice from scratch. Started with 3 clients out of our second bedroom, grew it to 42 in 6 years. I understood money, how it moved, where it hid, what it meant when numbers didn't line up. My mother-in-law knew this, and so, when she could no longer manage her own affairs, she asked me to help. Not Vanessa, not Brandon, me. I should have understood then that this was going to cost me something. My mother-in-law set up a limited power of attorney, specific, scoped, handled by her own lawyer, a careful woman named Ms. Tran who made very sure I understood the limits of what I was authorized to do. I could manage the rental accounts, pay contractors, handle the property management paperwork. I could not touch her personal accounts, could not make gifts, could not transfer assets. It was straightforward work. I was good at it. For 2 months everything ran smoothly, and then Vanessa called a family meeting. It wasn't called that, of course. It was called a Sunday dinner, but I'd been to enough Sunday dinners to know the difference, and this one had Brandon's particular energy all over it, that slightly too casual, too prepared quality he got when he was about to propose something he already knew was wrong. He waited until the dishes were cleared. Then he leaned back in his chair and said that he had some ideas about how to better support the family during this difficult time, and that as someone with a background in business development, he felt he could add real value if he had access to some of the resources already being managed within the estate. I watched my husband nod slowly. I watched Vanessa fold her hands in her lap. I said, "What resources specifically?" Brandon smiled the way he always smiled when I asked direct questions. A little too wide, a little too patient, like he was humoring a child. "The rental income," he said. He had contacts who could increase occupancy rates significantly. A temporary arrangement. Just to get things moving. I told him I was the authorized manager of those accounts, and any arrangement would need to go through Miss Tran and my mother-in-law's formal approval. He said, "Well, she wasn't really in a position to approve anything, was she?" I remember looking at my husband then. He was looking at his plate. I said, "She has a medical POA for healthcare decisions and a separate legal document for everything else. And I am that separate legal document, so yes, she very much is, through me, in a position to approve or not approve anything at all." Nobody said anything after that. Vanessa refilled everyone's wine. The evening ended early. That was March. By April, my mother-in-law had her second stroke, a worse one, and was moved to a care facility in Kelowna. The doctors were cautious about prognosis. She was aware some days, others not. We drove up every weekend. I managed her affairs by phone and email, kept meticulous records, sent monthly summaries to Ms. Tran. Brandon started texting my husband instead of me. Small things at first. Had we thought about consolidating the rental accounts? Didn't it make more sense to have everything in one place? One of his contacts could manage the storage facility much more efficiently. And wouldn't it be simpler for everyone if there was just one point of contact? My husband, who is not a bad man but who has a profound inability to recognize when he is being managed, started asking me if I'd thought about these things. I had. The answer was no. In May, my mother-in-law died. She went quietly on a Thursday morning while the nurses changed shifts. I was on a call with a client. My husband was in a meeting. Vanessa, I was told, was there. I've always wondered about that. The will had been updated 8 months earlier before the strokes. The estate was to be divided equally between my husband and Vanessa. Miss Tran handled the probate. It was going to take time. Estates in BC always do, but there were no surprises. Except for Brandon. Brandon did not like the timeline. He did not like that the estate was frozen pending probate. He did not like that there was a lawyer involved, a careful one who asked questions, who documented everything, who was not charmed by his confidence. He started calling the timeline a bureaucratic nightmare. He started talking about liquidity. He started, very carefully, making the case that surely the family could manage things among themselves, that professional fees were eating into everyone's inheritance, that there was no need to be so formal about everything. My husband started repeating these things to me at home. I kept records of every conversation. I kept every text. I am a bookkeeper. It is what I do. We were at Vanessa's for the post-funeral family gathering, one of those exhausting extended weekends where everyone is too sad and too together for too long, when I opened my banking app for no particular reason and saw the number that didn't make sense. Our joint account, the one my husband and I used for household expenses. $43,000. The savings we'd built over 2 years for a down payment on a bigger place, because we were finally in a position to move out of our apartment and buy something with a second bedroom and maybe a little yard. Gone. I sat at that kitchen table and I thought about the ice again, the way it flexes. I thought about everything I knew about how money moves. I thought about my husband in the next room, laughing, and then I did something that I'm proud of even now. I did not react. I closed the app. I picked up my cup of tea. I walked back into the living room and I sat down next to my husband. And I smiled at something Vanessa was saying about her mother's old garden, and I stayed that way for 2 more hours. Because I needed to know what I was dealing with before I said a single word. That night, back in our hotel room, we'd booked a room because I had always refused to sleep in Vanessa's house, one small boundary I had held onto. I pulled out my laptop and I started pulling records. Joint account access logs. I was a secondary account holder, which meant I had full read access to everything. The transfer had happened 4 days earlier, on the Wednesday morning, while I was in 2 back-to-back client calls. It had gone to an account I didn't recognize. A single transfer, just under the threshold that would trigger an automatic fraud flag review. $43,218. I sat with that number for a long time. Then I called our bank's fraud line, not the general number, the direct line I'd saved years ago when I'd done some bookkeeping work for a credit union, and learned which number actually got answered by a human being at 11 p.m. I spoke to a fraud investigator named Mr. Chow. I told him I believed there had been an unauthorized transfer from my joint account. I gave him the date, the amount, the destination account prefix. I did not mention my husband. I did not mention my sister-in-law or her husband. I gave him facts. Mr. Chow asked me to confirm whether I had authorized the transfer. I had not. He asked whether my co-account holder might have authorized it. I said I would need to verify that and I would call back in the morning. I hung up. I sat in the hotel room with the lights off. And then I heard the key card in the door, and my husband came in smelling like the whiskey Brandon always bought. That specific mid-shelf scotch that Brandon considered a statement about himself. And I made a decision about the next 12 hours of my life. I said I had a headache. He was sympathetic. We went to sleep. In the morning while he showered, I went through his phone. I want to be clear about something. I am not someone who goes through people's phones. I believe in privacy. I had never done it before in our marriage. I did it that morning because I already knew what I was going to find, and I needed the evidence before I could decide what to do with it. There were 43 messages between my husband and Brandon over the previous 2 weeks. The early ones were vague. Brandon talking about a short-term cash flow problem, a business opportunity that was time-sensitive, an embarrassing situation with a supplier. My husband expressing sympathy. Brandon escalating. My husband equivocating. And then, 9 days ago, my husband asking me to check the joint account balance in a text to Brandon. with our account number in the message. My husband had given Brandon our account number. I don't know if he knew what Brandon was going to do with it. I genuinely don't. I have thought about this many times since. What I know is that he gave a man I had never trusted the exact information that man needed to drain our savings. And he did not tell me, and when the money disappeared he was in the next room laughing. I took photographs of every message. I forwarded the account access records to my personal email. I put my husband's phone back on the nightstand, and then I called Ms. Tran. It was a Sunday. She answered on the second ring, which told me something about the kind of person she was. I explained the situation. I asked whether the transfer might constitute fraud under the criminal code. She said she'd need to review the specifics, but that transferring funds from a joint account without the co-holder's knowledge or consent, particularly through deception, was something the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit would be interested in. She said she'd make a call. She also said very carefully that I should speak to a family law lawyer before I did anything else. I already had someone in mind. I'd done bookkeeping for a small family law practice for 3 years. I knew exactly who to call. I went down to breakfast. My husband was already there helping Vanessa make eggs. Brandon was at the table with his coffee, that same half-smile he always had, the one that meant he thought he'd gotten away with something. I sat down across from him. I poured myself coffee. I looked at him the way I look at a set of accounts that don't add up, patiently, methodically, without showing anything. He asked if I'd slept well. I said I had slept very well, thank you. My husband put a plate of eggs in front of me. He kissed the top of my head. I ate my breakfast. 2 days later, I was back in Vancouver. I met with the family lawyer, a woman named Ms. Beaumont, who wore very good shoes and had the calm, measured energy of someone who had seen every version of this story before. I showed her everything, the transfer records, the text messages, the account access logs. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've documented this thoroughly." I told her it's what I do. She explained my options. Civilly, I could sue Brandon directly for the return of the funds. The evidence was strong. Criminally, I could file a report with the RCMP. Given the amount, the method, and the paper trail, it was a viable case. And matrimonially, my situation was more complicated. But the documentation I had was the kind of thing that would matter in a family court proceeding if it came to that. She said the word "if" carefully, but we both knew what she meant. I filed the RCMP report that afternoon. Fraud over $5,000, an indictable offense in Canada, potentially up to 14 years. The officer who took my report was thorough and unhurried. He asked good questions. I had answers for all of them. With the documentation that evening, my husband called. He wanted to know if I was. He said he'd noticed I seemed quiet at Vanessa's. He said he was worried about me, that the stress tests of his mother's death had been hard on everyone, that he thought we should maybe look at counseling. I told him I filed a fraud report today. The silence on the other end of the line was a particular kind of silence. Not surprised, more like someone who has been waiting for a specific sound and has finally heard it. He said, "What?" I said I filed a fraud report with the RCMP regarding the unauthorized transfer of $43,218 from our joint account to an account registered to Brandon. He said, "I can explain that." I said, "I know you can. I've read the texts, I've pulled the account records, and I've spoken to Ms. Tran and a family lawyer, so whenever you're ready to explain, I'd suggest doing it with your own lawyer present." He called Vanessa before he called a lawyer. I know this because Vanessa called me 12 minutes later. She was not calm. She said I was tearing the family apart at the worst possible time. She said Brandon had meant to pay it back. It was always a loan. My husband had agreed to it, and so it wasn't fraud. It was just a family arrangement. She said I was vindictive and cold, and that I'd never really been part of this family anyway. I let her talk. When she was finished, I said, "If it was a loan, I'll need the signed loan agreement, the repayment terms, and the date by which the funds will be returned to my account." She said I was being impossible. I said I was being a bookkeeper. I hung up, and then I poured myself a glass of wine, and I sat on my balcony in the April evening, looking out at the North Shore mountains, and I let myself feel it. The particular grief of realizing that the story you'd been telling yourself about your life was not entirely the true one. My husband came home the next morning. He sat down across from me at our kitchen table, the same table where I'd taught him to file his own taxes when we were first dating, because he'd been doing them wrong for 4 years. And he looked like someone who had not slept. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't known Brandon was going to take the money. He'd just given him the account number because Brandon said he needed it to set up a proper repayment transfer from a business deal they'd been discussing. He said he should have told me. He said he knew how it looked. I asked him if he had reported the account number sharing to the RCMP. He hadn't. I told him he should. I told him I needed him to understand that I had spent 6 years building my practice and 2 years building those savings, and I had done both of those things with careful attention because I knew better than most people that money doesn't appear from nowhere, and it doesn't come back from nowhere either. I told him I was not going to pretend the last 2 weeks hadn't happened. I told him I needed time to figure out what I wanted. He asked if I was leaving. I said I was a bookkeeper. I needed to balance the accounts before I could tell him what the bottom line was. He didn't say anything, but I think he understood. The RCMP investigation moved at the pace these things move, not fast but steadily. Brandon retained a lawyer almost immediately, which told me he'd been expecting this. The funds, it turned out, had already been partially spent, a deposit on a recreational property in the shoe swap that Vanessa had been posting about on social media for weeks without connecting those dots for me, which told me she either hadn't known where the money came from or hadn't wanted to know. Ms. Tran reviewed everything and confirmed that none of the estate assets had been touched. Brandon had apparently not been able to get access to those accounts and had gone for the easier target. Which was me. Which was perhaps what he'd been planning all along. My civil suit for recovery of the funds was filed 3 weeks after my RCMP report. Ms. Beaumont was efficient and unimpressed by Brandon's lawyer's initial response, which claimed the transfer had been a consensual loan. She pointed out, very calmly, that there was no documentation of any loan agreement, that the transfer had occurred without my knowledge or consent, and that my husband, who had provided the account information, had already given a statement to the RCMP acknowledging he had not informed me before doing so. Brandon's lawyer went quiet for a while after that. The money came back in 2 installments. The first $30,000 arrived in my account on a Thursday afternoon. I stared at the notification for a long time. The second, the remaining $13,218 came 6 weeks later, after Vanessa and Fran sold a car. I know this because my husband told me. We were still talking, he and I, carefully, with a lot of things left unsaid, but talking. I'd moved out in May. Not dramatically. I found a sublet near my office. A 1-bedroom with good light and a building that allowed dogs, which mattered because I'd finally gotten the dog I'd been wanting for 3 years and which my husband had always said was too much responsibility right now. I named her Pesto. She was a small brown mutt with enormous ears and the calm confidence of a dog who had never doubted her own worth for a single day. Pesto was the best decision I made that year, possibly in my entire adult life. I won't tell you that everything resolved cleanly. That's not how this kind of story goes, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise. My husband and I were in counseling, separately and together, in that order. He'd told his family that he had provided information that was used without his full knowledge to access our joint funds, and that this had had serious consequences, and that he was cooperating with the RCMP. Vanessa had not spoken to me since the day she called me vindictive. That was, honestly, fine. What I can tell you is this. The week the criminal case moved to the Crown's consideration, meaning the RCMP had forwarded everything to the Crown prosecutor for a charging decision, Vanessa called my husband. I know because he told me about it afterward with a particular look on his face that I hadn't seen before. Something between exhaustion and clarity. She had asked him to intervene, to ask me to withdraw my cooperation, to consider what this was doing to the family, to remember that Brandon was the father of her children, to think about whether I really wanted to be responsible for tearing all of this apart over money. My husband told her that I hadn't torn anything apart. He told her that Brandon had taken $43,000 from his wife without her knowledge, and that the family had spent 2 weeks asking his wife to absorb that quietly, and that she had declined to do so, and he was not going to ask her otherwise. He told me this standing in the doorway of my sublet, holding a coffee from the place around the corner that he'd remembered I liked. I didn't say much, I just nodded. He asked if he could come in. I said not yet, but maybe. Pesto had come to the door by then, wagging her whole body in that undignified way she had, and he bent down to scratch her ears, and she leaned into his hand like he was the best thing she'd ever encountered, because she was a dog and she didn't hold grudges. I watched the two of them and I thought, accounts can be balanced. They can also be closed. The question is always which one you're dealing with. I didn't have the answer yet, but for the first time in a long time, I was the one holding the records. I was the one who understood what the numbers meant. And I was the one who would decide what to do with them. That, it turned out, was enough.